a series, 12 Gifts of Christmas, and really it's all about one gift, the gift of Jesus Christ. We talked about this last week. So often we just look at Jesus and say, yeah, it's great we got Jesus for Christmas, but what else? And we miss out really on who he is. And last week we looked into what Luke had to say about Mary and the announcement of the birth and the gifts of courage and confidence and celebration that we got last week. And this week we're going to look at something different. But as I opened up this week, I was thinking about how early this year, and I don't know, I know every year it seems like it's a little bit earlier that they start the Christmas stuff, but man, I just think this year, I think it was somewhere around August 30th that I noticed Christmas trees appearing in stores. We hadn't done Halloween, we hadn't done, I mean, no lie, they're going crazy on these retail sales, because the other day we were in a store and they had Valentine's Day stuff out. You know, I'm just like, are you kidding me? And so, and I said the other day, it was probably a couple weeks ago. It was before Thanksgiving, and so it was just crazy how that goes. But you know, I like the old stuff. I grew up, in fact, my wife and I, we watched, sometimes we watch those old black and white movies. I know you kids are like, what? You'd watch black and white? Some of them are really good. Christmas movies, I like It's a Wonderful Life. That's a staple in our house. If you haven't watched it, shame on you, but it's a great movie. I used to make my kids watch it every Christmas Eve. We watched it, and so it's one of those great. Miracle on 34th Street, the original black and white one, was another great one. We watched it at Thanksgiving. So I have these holiday traditions, but I grew up watching like Andy Williams Christmas specials and things like that. And some of you guys are like, who's Andy Williams? Okay, he's a long time ago gone, and even Burl Ives, and when the Barbara Mandrell and her sisters had a show together and they did Christmas specials, that'll be a long time ago too. And some of you guys are like, I don't even know who they are. That's when I was real little. But you could always tell Christmas was coming because of those things, but I think the very first thing that always gave me a clue that Christmas was on its way, and I always thought it sort of went with the song Silver Bells. I like I know some of them aren't Christian Christmas songs, but I like all the holiday songs, Christmas songs too. But Silver Bells, it talks about living in a city, which I'm a city guy, you know that, and so I lived in cities for a long time, or urbanized areas, and you could tell in a city that Christmas was coming by really a lot of different things, but one particular thing was the holiday decorations, or the Christmas decorations. And out of those decorations, there usually was one that was sort of more noticeable than any others. It was the lights of Christmas. And I'm not going to ask how many of you finally got your lights up, or if Ben actually did what Holly wanted him to do and put them up. I'm just going to tell you, Ben, I already got mine up, so I'm pretty good about that one. Bad back and all, we got ours up. But it's a struggle sometimes as a man trying to get those lights up, those stupid lights, and then you got to take them down like a couple weeks later. And so that's why I know we get like, really, do we have to put them up? But lights at Christmas, can you imagine a Christmas tree? I mean, I don't imagine too many Christmas trees without lights on them, right? And I appreciate Johnny and Lisa decorating our church for us this year, and I like the tree with the lights on. A tree without lights just doesn't make sense to me. And maybe that's just how I am these days, but I like lights, and I like lots of them. Although maybe, and I know there's a lot of variety of different people in their beliefs about lights. Some of you guys like the Eat at Joe's blinking lights that, you know, you feel like you're, I don't know, maybe I've got some epilepsy in me and it just sort of drives me crazy. I don't know, I shouldn't joke about that, it's not funny. But, you know, some of those things are pretty cool. Others are just, you know, maybe you're the kind that I just throw a bunch of inflatables. There was a yard down in Florida near us, and I'm telling you, I don't know if that guy had 1 square inch of his lawn that didn't have an inflatable on it. And it was just a massive, like somebody had thrown up Christmas on his lawn. And it didn't look good either, by the way. It just was a lot of it. But everybody would drive by and go, oh, and that was the disgust. But Christmas lights, can you imagine that? And as we take a look today, I think lights are so important. In fact, if you didn't know this, it's not just, hey, this is a tradition of man. Do you realize Christmas and lights go together? From even the earliest of times. In fact, John, and that's where we're at today, the Gospel of John, as he tells his beginning story of the Messiah, Jesus Christ, the birth story, he does something so unusual. Matthew and Luke, they're the guys that are recording every little bit about how Jesus was born, how Mary and Joseph, they went through this whole birth process. And even people like the shepherds, the wise men who came years down the road, and others were involved in this whole early story. John chapter John chapter 1, he says, in the beginning, and I can just picture John as he writes this, he's thinking of Genesis chapter 1, because that's really the reference he's given us here. And he wants to draw our minds to that Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. In the beginning, God created. And he says this, in the beginning was the Word. And if you don't understand, he's using Greek terminology here. It doesn't show up as much in English, but the word means logos. And that's a term that would be understandable by the philosophers of Greek, because in Greek, wisdom was the God. These people worship wisdom. And here is John, he's trying to get their attention, so he uses their terminology, but he wants them to understand that it's not just any wisdom, it's the wisdom, the living wisdom. He says, in the beginning was the Word. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And it draws in all the people and their attention to this story he's getting ready to tell in an unusual way. And he said, verse 2, he was with God in the beginning. That's his pre-existent self. By the way, that's very deep in doctrine. We won't talk about that today as much, but that's just, once again, the pre-existent self. He is not a created being, is what he's saying here. He's the God creator. Verse 3, through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. He is the source of everything. That's what he's saying here. In verse 4, he says, in him was life, and that is so important to us. In him was life, and that life was the, say it with me, light. And that life was the light of all mankind. That's the Christmas light we're going to talk about today. That's the Christmas light here we talk about. The very first Christmas light you can ever hear about is this right here in John chapter 1. He says, that light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. Some of the translation says has not comprehended, understood it. But I love this. It says overcome it in the NIV. Overcome it. The darkness didn't overcome the light. You say, well, that's not strange. The lights are supposed to be brighter than the darkness, aren't they? Or they're not worth anything. Yeah, but we live in an awful dark world today, and that's the truth. He goes on to say in verse 6, and he reminds us of a couple weeks ago when Tracy preached the message about Zechariah and John the Baptist. He says there was a man sent from God whose name was John. Now, I realize this is confusing because John's writing this, and he's writing about John, but he's clearly making sure we understand what John he's talking about. He's not talking about himself. He's talking about that story of the precursor, John the Baptist is what he was talking about. So he doesn't use the title the Baptist, but he's talking about John here. He says, he came to witness and testify concerning that, say it, light. That light, so that through him all might, what? Believe. The purpose of the light is to bring us to the truth, to guide us out of darkness. That's what he's telling us here. He himself was not that light, just in case, because there's a lot of people confused about John the Baptist. John here wants to make and set the record straight. He wasn't God. He was not that light. He only came as a witness to that light, or better yet, the word witness there, a reflection of the light. He's that reflector of God. Verse 9, the true light that gives light to everyone was coming into the world. You know, when John writes this, and John, he puts it in such good words there, just so great as we look into this, and you probably thought, like, I just thought these were passing comments. No, John is actually giving us his version of the birthing story of Jesus Christ, the Messiah, the coming. But he puts it in such definite terms because John understood two truths that you and I need to understand right off the bat as we get going today. Number one, the world is a dark place. That's a no-brainer there. That's Captain Obvious, right? The world's a dark place. You just have to turn on your TV to the news sometime, which isn't any good news. It's all bad news, isn't it? And you realize the world is a dark place. We hear things all the time. In fact, there's no news today other than bad news, and bad news comes in droves. There are wars and rumors of wars. There are earthquakes. There are tornadoes. There are all kinds of problems. And I tell you, then we get into the character of man, and we can start talking about cheaters and liars and despisers of people who are good, and that's just our politics that we're talking about there. We get into normal day life, we talk about abusers, and we get people who are child abusers and pornography and all the different despicable things that we don't want to really talk about in the light. But the world is a very dark place. And you know, the world that Jesus comes into, the world that the Messiah is coming into is no different. Maybe it was darker than we are today. You say, is that possible? Yes. Absolutely. You see, when the Bible tells us over in Luke and Matthew that the guy who was in charge was a guy named Caesar Augustus was not a good guy. He was a ruler that inherited a kingdom that was built on error and folly and pride, and he elevates himself up to, in his own opinion, the level of God in his arrogance. You have a guy named Herod who eventually, when he finds out that Jesus is born in Bethlehem, and this is a couple years down the road, when the wise men come through. By the way, the wise men really weren't at the manger. If I just blew your theology, I'm sorry, but they weren't. Okay, they weren't. They were in a different total location. He wasn't in the inn. He wasn't there at that. He was in a house. And the term that they used was not a newborn infant. It was young boy. And so anyway, that we'll talk about that at a later date. But when those wise men come and say, hey, where is he, the king of the Jews? Herod panics because he called himself the king of the Jews. And Herod just slyly says, hey, just let me know when you find him because I want to give him something. And they were warned not to do that. So Herod's frustrated, and so what does he give? He kills all the babies 2 and under in that region just to try and stop Jesus from becoming that king that he was so fearful of. That's the kind of world. And we talk about our bad guys around here, and you could talk about bad presidents, bad politicians, bad whatever. Do you have a president that's going out and murdering people just because he wants to stay on his throne? Maybe. But man, they weren't hiding it then. These guys, they didn't just lie to you. They took what they wanted and they did what they wanted. And this is the world that Jesus comes to. It was the perfect timing, but it wasn't any brighter than it is today. That was the first thing John would have us know about this light. We live in a world that's very dark. The second thing, though, is so important, is that we will never find our way or see reality unless Jesus is our light. That's what John would tell us today. And that really is the summarizing truth of what he did, importantly, tell us in his gospel message here. But it's something actually that was told to him way before this. And our real text is over in Isaiah. So if you have your Bibles, flip over to Isaiah chapter 9. And you're going to be amazed at what Isaiah says. You probably have read it before, but I'm going to pull the entirety of it together here for you. If you put John, what he said about the light and the true light of Christmas, and then tie it into what Isaiah tells, and you realize Isaiah is writing this hundreds of years before Jesus is even coming on the scene. John's writing after the fact. Isaiah writes before it. In Isaiah chapter 9, he says this in verse number 1. He says, nevertheless. And that's a word that is important because that word tells us that we need to go and find out what he's writing about before this. We'll get back to that in a minute, though. He says, nevertheless, there will be no more gloom for those who are in distress. Amen. That's a great sermon there. No more gloom. I don't know about you, but I had some distress this week. Did you? I mean, I feel like every day seems to build some distress in my life. And I know we're not supposed to have anxiety. I'm trying to get my perspective focused on God. I don't want discontentment in my life. But I want you to know there is a lot of distress in this world we live in. Distress from evil people. All I have to do is pick up something and read something, hear something, find out somebody's doing something dishonest in our world. Find out the distress of nature in tornadoes that ripped through states and left people without husbands and wives and kids, without homes. Devastation. It makes me feel better about my state of being, but it makes me feel distressed because there are those issues in life. He says, nevertheless, there will be no more gloom for those who are in distress. In the past, he humbled the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali. Now, let me just make a comment here. When Isaiah writes this, so you understand what he's saying here, he's using the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali to represent the northern tribes of Israel. That's why he wrote that. That's just his way of saying the northern tribes, the 10 northern tribes. We know how there was a civil war in Israel when Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, was foolish, and he split the kingdom in two. And so Jeroboam, the servant of Solomon, takes the 10 northern tribes, and Rehoboam, he gets the 2 southern tribes, and that's how they split it. And they were at a war, killing each other, fighting each other, taking territory, whatever they could. And this whole deal, when he reminds us of this, he tells us, and it's interesting why he used this. In the past, he humbled the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali. Now, Isaiah's reference in the past there, he's talking about when the Assyrian army comes in and actually takes over Israel. They conquer Israel, and they rip them out, and they hold them as hostages until God allows the people to come back in. That's way down the road, because the bottom half of Israel, Judah and Benjamin, they're going to end up being Babylonian captives, and everybody will return at the same time, and that's for a long way down the road. That's his reference here, but I find it very strange. If you ever ask, why did he say Zebulun, why did he say Naphtali? Well, if you were to ever take a map of the ancient lands where they're divided by tribes and put that over where Jesus did ministry, you know what you'd find? That Naphtali and Zebulun actually were the areas that included Nazareth and the surrounding areas of Galilee, all the way around to the Lake of Galilee, which had Capernaum, which was his headquarters for his base of operations. So really, he's giving us some insight into future happenings that Jesus, this Messiah, is going to come from here. And though they're in trouble now with the Assyrians, there's hope in the future. And he goes on to say this, but in the future, he will honor Galilee of the nations by the way of the sea beyond the Jordan. What he's talking about is that region in there where the road goes right through the area that Jesus was ministering into most. So that's our hope. And then he says this, the people walking in darkness. Hey, that sounds a lot what we realized that John wanted us to understand, that the world today is dark. He says, the people walking in darkness have seen a great, what? Light. Seen a great light, not just an ordinary light, a great light. It's the light of Christmas as he's referring to here. It's the same thing John was telling us about. He said, on those living in the land of deep darkness, he's referring to Israel and the problems they had spiritually, those living in the land of deep darkness, a light has dawned, just like the bright sun as it comes up in the mornings. That's his reference here. You have enlarged the nation and increased their joy. We would sing it like this, joy to the world, right? That's what he's saying right there, isn't it? It is. He says they rejoice before you as people rejoice at the harvest. Now, you and I don't know, maybe, not too many of us are farmers that we harvest anymore because we don't live in an agrarian society like they did back then. But do you realize what he's saying here is they all did the happy dance when the crops came in because they were going to live another day, they had something to eat. That's what he's saying. He said this great light is so important to us. It's as good as, if not better, when you get the best harvest, which you know is going to sustain your life. He goes on to say, as warriors rejoice when dividing the plunder. When do warriors rejoice when they're dividing the plunder? When they win. You don't divide plunder when you lose. So he says, like fighting the greatest battle of your life and you get to win, he says that's what you're going to rejoice about, that joy to the world thing. Go on, verse 4, he says, for as in the day of Midian's defeat. Reference there, Midian's defeat. Go back to the book of Judges, and you're going to find this character named Gideon, and he was the guy as the judge that God used to free his people of Midian. Okay, and if you don't know the story there, Gideon, he was already a very unique character in that he didn't have much to offer God, which is why God chose him. But God whittles his army down to 300 men because he didn't want Israel taking any kind of glory out of this. And so he reminds them like, hey, remember when I freed you from that horrible people, Midian, their army was just ridiculous in their size, and you didn't have to use a weapon. You didn't have to lift a finger against them. Why? Because God did all the work here. He goes on to say, as in the day of Midian's feet, you have shattered the yoke that burdens them, the bar across their shoulders, the rod of the oppressor. He gives us 3 different examples of how God has freed them from their oppressor, and that's a timely thing. He goes on to say in verse 5, every warrior's boot used in battle and every garment rolled in blood will be destined for burning. Why would you burn warriors' boots, and why would you burn their clothes? Because they don't need them anymore. That's the hallelujah there. He's saying, hey, you know what? This great light that you're singing the happy dance over, better than your best harvest, better than the best battles that you've won, better than what God did against Midian. You know what? You're going to be doing this happy dance because God is breaking all those things that held you back. You're going to be free from what is holding you back. That's the promise here. And then he says the words that you've probably heard before out of this passage. For to us a child is born, to us a son is given. And the government will be on his shoulders. And he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the greatness of his government and peace there will be no end. He will reign on David's throne and over his kingdom, establishing and upholding it with justice and righteousness from that time on and forever. The zeal of the Lord Almighty will accomplish this. Whew. And if you don't get excited about that, that's pretty exciting stuff to me. But you have to realize, John, as he's looking at Jesus being born, you realize John has now finished this whole traveling with Jesus for 3.5 years, watching Jesus die, finding out Jesus was resurrected, that he really was the Son of God. He's been there when Jesus ascended and gave him that great commission to go into all the world and tell them the news, the good news, the proclamation of truth, that he gave them courage, confidence, and they can celebrate what we talked about last week. And John's reflecting on this in his mind as he pens these words to the people who were not necessarily Jewish, who are not necessarily, they were the people of John in writing his gospel. If you don't know this, he wrote his gospel, intended his account of Jesus' life for those of us in the church. This is the gospel account for us. And so when John says, hey, you know what? Let me let you in on a little secret. The great gift that you're looking for this year, it's tied to a light. And I remember it as I think about what Isaiah said. Everything Isaiah said was true. And Isaiah, he would sit here and he would tell you, you know, I mentioned this early on. If you go back to verses 1 and 2, especially verse 2, he mentioned it twice. He said, the people are in darkness. The people are in darkness. And that's what John's saying. Yes, the light came to the darkness and the darkness didn't overcome it. And that's the great news. But Isaiah keeps telling us all about this darkness. And you have to ask, why did he say that? You realize chapter numbers and verse numbers were put in there way after Jesus and all those guys came on the scene. They were put in there for us to help us find places. So really these chapter numbers don't mean a whole lot. Just points of reference so we can find things. So we have to go back to really where the paragraph starts in chapter 8 of Isaiah. In chapter 8 of Isaiah, he talks about and tells us, gives a little bit more explanation. Verse 19 is where the paragraph starts. And this is what Isaiah says. He says, when someone tells you to consult mediums and spiritists who whisper and mutter, should not a people inquire of their God? He's giving these people, and what you have to understand is Isaiah saying, hey, you know what? The people of the land, they're in this utter darkness. You know what they're doing? They're reading their horoscopes. They're looking to advice from people who are spiritists, who are mediums, the people that they thought were in touch with God, the people they thought were important, the people that obviously you would turn to in that day and age that they would turn to because they had lost sight of who God was. And they're looking for God and an answer for God. That's what they're trying to do. He goes on to say, why consult the dead on behalf of the living? And he's asking some good questions because that's what they're doing. And he makes verse 20 stands out. He says, consult God's instruction. Great verse here. Consult God's instruction and the testimony of warning. If anyone does not speak according to this word, they have no light of dawn. Ooh, there's that important word again, light again. Light of dawn. Distressed and hungry. Remember he talked about those people who are not going to have to be distressed anymore. Distressed and hungry, they will roam through the land when they are famished. They will become enraged and look upward and curse their king and their God. Then they will look to the earth and see only distress and darkness and fearful gloom, and they will be thrust into utter darkness. Darkness. Why? What is he saying here? Isaiah is simply saying, you know what? The people of the nation of Israel, they're in a time period where everything's going wrong. They've walked away from God. They are not consulting his word. They have been killing his prophets. And now Isaiah has get this task of giving this prophecy, which is a near-far prophecy. It was relevant to them at that point, but it also was going to be a far-off prophecy that's going to tell us about this Messiah, this light that was coming. And he says, here's the problem. It's the problem that we have today. With the philosophers of our world, you know what? We sit back and say, you know what? I think we can figure this out. I think we can figure it out. You just get enough self-help books and you just get enough of smarts on your own, you probably can figure it out. Let's listen to the people who are economic wizards. Let's listen to the people who are political wizards. Let's listen to the news commentators. Let's listen to this person, that person. And you know what? That's what he's saying they were doing in their time. They were turning to the mediums, to the spiritists. They were turning to those people going, hey, we need help. And those people were telling them, yeah, it's a dark world you live in. So here's what you need to do. We can figure this thing out on our own. And Isaiah says, no, you can't. you need to turn to God's word, the word of command, because that's the only hope of the light. And you know what? I think what we sometimes do is the fact that people believe that our Christmas message is about peace on earth and goodwill to men. And certainly the angels said that to him, but it wasn't really the message of Christmas. See, that's the message of John Lennon and Yoko Ono. It was. And I don't know about you, but I don't think they had much peace. The truth of the matter is, it was all about the light. And John, he doesn't write in his writings about peace on earth and goodwill to men, does he now? John says, hey, it's the light that came this Christmas. It's the light that will change things. It's the light that has life. It's the light that will deliver us from darkness. It's not peace on earth. It's not hanging out with goodwill to men. And that's what we've made Christmas into, and that's where we failed to unwrap the gifts that God has for us. See, the message of Christmas is that on those living in the land, according to Isaiah chapter 9, verse 2, on those living in the land of deep darkness, a light has dawned. And that light has dawned. He gives that illusion, that illustration of a sun breaking up over the horizon. I don't know how many times I've seen that. It just amazes me. I remember probably my most favorite time is sitting there as I face the Serengeti Plain in Tanzania, watching, no one else around, they were all sleeping in bed, and I watched the sun come up. It was amazing. There was no there wasn't anything man-made for miles and miles. Clear as could be. You see animals moving. And you see the fingerprint of God on creation. And just moves you to realize that light that's dawned right there, that brought clarity to everything I couldn't see. All the dangerous animals I was scared of in the night that were making noises, I could clearly see now. At least I thought I could. And that's the light, the picture that Isaiah is making here. He says that light is dawn. See, when Isaiah speaks of God and this light that's dawning on a dark world, he's using this metaphor of the sun, but he's also letting us see into the gift of God that John is talking about. And today we're going to talk about 3 gifts that we have as the Messiah arrives that John talks about. Because John in chapter 1 verse 9, he said the light has come. Has come. It's the light that has come to all mankind, and that's the great news for us. 3 things. For gift number, and we're going to keep on numbering them. Gift number 4, if you've been keeping up with us, gift number 4 is life. See, that illusion of the sun gives us the understanding that the sun gives life, and so does Jesus Christ. It really is. That's the whole illustration there. That's the parallel that Isaiah and John are both drawing to on this light. He's not talking about electric light bulbs on a Christmas tree. He's talking about the light of the world. He's talking about the very Son of God, or we can picture the sun rising on that horizon. He tells us that the sun is the source of life, and it makes me think about the Apostle Paul as he stands there on Mars Hill in front of the Areopagus, discussing their idols that this community of Athens is wholly given to. And Paul uses their own language, and listen to what Paul says in Acts chapter 17, verse 28. He says this, that in God we live and move and have our very own being. That's life, isn't it? And yet we live in a land of darkness, and you know darkness, there's nothing alive in darkness. Darkness is death, isn't it? Think about Psalm 23 and David's illustration there. He says, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow, darkness, right? The shadow of death. I fear no evil. Why? Because you're with me, and you're the light of the world. You're the light of the world. See, when we look at that manger scene and we see that baby who we go, man, that's cool. Babies are so cool, and I'm so glad that we have a newborn here today. Asher, if you haven't gotten to see Asher, you can see him. Don't touch. No, I'm just kidding. It's so great. I'm so happy for Rob and Sarah and the blessing they got. This Christmas present came a little early, but it's great. But you know what? We don't just look at Jesus and go, what a cute baby. Let's take some pictures. No. This is a baby that's going to bring life to us. And that life is the light of all mankind, because he's the light that gives us a chance over the darkness of this world. He was the light they needed in Roman Empire during the times when things were the darkest, when people were being murdered left and right. Do you realize the common practice of that day wasn't abortion? It was have the baby and take a baby just like this newborn, take him out to a burning trash heap and put him on it because we don't want the baby. Because baby means somebody doesn't get to eat. Baby means more money, more cost. Jesus said, I've come to change this. I bring light that's going to give life. And you know what his followers did? They went out to those burning trash heaps and they picked up those babies that weren't there. They were Romans, they were Greeks, they were any other ethnicity but theirs. And they picked them up off those trash piles, brought them home, and they fed them and raised them to be their own. Do you realize Christianity is so unique in this? Started out with the government executing Jesus Christ. And some 300 years down the road, Christianity went from being the hated religion of the empire to being the empire's religion. Whew. That's life. That's life. There's no reason why Christianity should still be in existence today other than Jesus Christ. It's not a set of rules. It's not even a book. Christianity is not a book. We base what we know through the book, but you know what it is? It's a person, Jesus Christ, that we're called to, who gave us life. And that's what Paul would tell us. And that's the blessing of Christmas. He didn't bring us to death. He brought us to life. Number 5, truth. Truth, the gift of truth. See, the light, the sun, it reveals the truth, doesn't it? See, all during the night, you may not see yourself. In fact, I've started to say it this way. I don't know how many of you guys got up this morning and went into a dark room, picked out some clothes in the dark, didn't turn a light on, put them on, and walked out. Maybe combed your hair and did all that stuff in the dark. I'm afraid maybe somebody did, but I don't want that to be. We don't do that. I don't know if my wife ever has one time ever done anything like that in the dark. In fact, I can count on this. She's going to have every light on she can when she goes to do her hair and her makeup and all the rest of that stuff. Why? Because it reveals the truth, and it's important to her what she looks like when she walks out the door. Notice I didn't say that about me because it wouldn't be true as much, right? That's the truth. The light reveals the truth to us, and that's what God does for us. This light reveals truth of the things and how they really are. And Jesus comes into a very dark world and he says, let me turn on the light. And what happens when you turn on the light? All the cockroaches start running, don't they? It's gross, but it's true. You turn on the light and all the bugs start disappearing because it reveals the truth. You see, John also wrote just a couple verses down that the light, men didn't like it because their deeds were dark and evil, right? That's what we hate about the light. But it reveals the truth. You know, John, over in one of his other letters, John wrote this in 1 John chapter 1, verses 5 and 6. He said this, God is light. He's thinking along the same line. The same guy wrote it. He says, God is light. In him, listen, in him there is no darkness. None. He's the only person you can say that about. I hate to say it, but in you and me, there's some darkness. We know it. We have dark thoughts. We think dark things. And you say, well, no, not me. Yeah, the next time somebody ticks you off, you're thinking some pretty dark thoughts. You are. You're thinking some hateful thoughts. Person that cuts you off in line or cuts you off in your car. Road rage. Person that treats you poorly. In him, there was no darkness at all. If we claim to have fellowship with him, yet we walk in darkness, we lie and do not live out the truth. Why? Because God is truth. God is truth. And see, that light, that gift of Christmas doesn't just reveal good things to us, it reveals the truth. And that's why sometimes people didn't like it. In fact, that's what the Pharisees hated about Jesus so much. That's what the high priest hated about him so much. They hated the fact that he was revealing to everybody what they were all about, revealing the truth about their living and the darkness they were in. And that's the sad thing, but it's what we need, isn't it? The truth. See, Jesus said this over in John chapter 8, verse 32. He said, you'll know the truth, and the truth will set you free. And that's what the present of truth gives us. The truth. I think babies teach us a lot of truth, don't they? These new parents here, they're learning a lot of truth about themselves and a lot of truth about how the world is. See, we want our little perfect world, But you know what? That baby is going to get you up at times you don't want to get up. And make you do things you don't want to do. Come on, Ben, we know you don't get up. That's Holly, man. Come on, man. That baby reveals the truth about us, though, doesn't it? And just wait. It's going to reveal a lot more truth as it grows. It's going to reveal the truth. Sometimes the part I hated about being a parent is sometimes it revealed to me how weak I was as a person. It revealed that darkness in me. So as kids, they have a way of bringing out the truth in us. And that's what that baby in that manger at Bethlehem did. It revealed the truth to all mankind, that truth that we live in darkness, and the only way we can get out of it is to get into the light, and we need the truth of the light. And men love darkness because their deeds are evil. And that's the hard part about it. You ever wonder why churches aren't packed to capacity? Certainly we could sit back and we go, well, it's the building, it's the person preaching. You can blame a lot of me. It's the music, it's all these things. No, it's the light. See, it's easier to stay in bed on Sunday morning in the darkness than to get exposed to the light. It's true. And that's not a condemnation. That's the easy part, isn't it? Miss a Sunday or two, and what happens? You start to get in a habit of not coming, right? Miss a day or two of not reading your Bible, not communing with God, and what happens? It's easy, isn't it? It's easy to slip away out of it. See, we don't like the light because it exposes who we are. We don't like the truth. That's why we don't want to spend too much. Well, I got better things to do. Sure you do. You like to crawl back into the darkness with all the cockroaches. But we need the light because it reveals what we need the most. Which brings us to number 6. Gift number 6, beauty. Beauty. Light reveals beauty. It does. Light reveals beauty. Sun reveals beauty, doesn't it? I was thinking I have a friend of mine who works for the government, and he travels a lot, and he's military. He was just writing he's over in Denmark right now, in Copenhagen. And he said, the hard thing about Denmark, Copenhagen, right now, is they only have 6 hours of daylight during this time of year. I don't know if you've ever read about places like that, Alaska, places that don't have a lot of daylight. Do you realize depression is so much higher in those kind of areas because of that? It's what darkness does. Darkness causes us to crawl into our own self-pity, causes us to crawl into those areas we like to hide, we like to isolate, we like to get away from it. But the light is dazzling, it shines, it brings joy to us. Isn't it amazing what a good sunny day does to us as opposed to a gloomy, rainy day? I had a teacher in high school, Miss Pretzler. She was just odd. She really was. And I'll tell you why. She hated sunny days, but give her a good, gloomy, rainy day, she was rejoicing. She had this little cloud that went over her sometimes. She scared the rest of the students. She did. The people like that, scary. She was not right in the head. No, she was a really good teacher, she really was. But she had that quirk about her. She got so excited when it was a rainy, gloomy, disgusting day. And I don't know whether she liked it because she knew that meant as kids we couldn't go outside and do anything or what. But she just loved it. And I think about this, and I think about what we need is the light of the joy of God in our life. God's source of all beauty. I think about this, though. As beautiful as God made things, Isaiah 53, a familiar passage, just a couple of chapters down from where we're at in Isaiah 9, Isaiah writes this about Jesus. He said he had no beauty. Verse number 2, he had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering and familiar with pain, like one from whom people hide their faces. He was despised, and we held him in low esteem. You know why he has to be like that? Because at this point, he's the suffering Savior who takes upon him the darkness of us. He's no longer the light of the world at that point. He's the suffering Savior who's bore our sins, what we have in our own souls, that darkness. And he's become comely is the word in some of the versions use. He's not beautiful anymore. Of course, That's the whole chapter that refers to us as sheep. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have. That's the darkness within us. The light, this infant in a manger in Bethlehem, gives us the gift of beauty. See, the truth of the matter is, God is beautiful, but we're the ugly ones. And the only way we get to be God's beauty is by the light of the world shining in us and removing the ugliness. It's the righteousness of Jesus Christ in our lives that allows us to have that light within us. And that's the truth. So those are the three gifts, which lead me to this question. How can this divine light dawn on us? That's what Isaiah says there in verse number 2. And Isaiah answers it in verse 6 and 7. He says this, "For to us a child is born." Isn't that the gift? In case you were wondering, so how do I get this light? How do I get the truth? How do I get beauty? How do I get all these things you talked about? How do I get that life? For to us a child was born. Jesus is the divine light of the world because he brings a new life to our spiritual darkness. Because he shows us the truth that heals us of our spiritual blindness. Because he is the beauty that breaks us of our addictions. That's the truth. See, the bottom line to this whole idea today is the fact that Jesus is a light for us when all other lights go out. You see, the light of man's intellect, the light of personality, the light of fame, fortune, friends, those are just dimly little light bulbs on a Christmas tree. The light of the world was born in a manger. How can this light become ours? That's the other question I'd ask. And Isaiah answered it. He says, to us a child is born, and to us a son is given. When you give something, that's a gift, isn't it? The hardest part about this is the fact that this gift can only be received by grace. Christmas is about giving presents, and we started that last week. It's about getting presents and giving presents, but really it's about the greatest present ever given, Jesus Christ. But the hardest part about this present, some presents require you to put away your pride. Could you imagine if somebody wrapped up a book for you this Christmas that was titled, How to Be Better Looking, wrapped it up and gave it to you? It would take a lot of pride to think that was a good gift, wouldn't it? Or how to not be so overweight. We wouldn't like those books. You see, if you ever wondered why the world rejects the light, the gift of Jesus Christ to them is a gift that says, you can't do it yourself. You have to put away your pride. You have to open up your heart to grace. Grace is, I didn't deserve this, but it's a gift to me. And you have to accept it on God's terms.